Today I'd like to talk about how to create tints and shades using paint. A tint can be made by mixing white with a color to create a lighter, brighter version of that color. A shade is the opposite. It can be made by mixing black with a color to create a darker, less bright version of the color. You can create tints and shades with many different kinds of art supplies like paints, Model Magic clay, crayons, colored pencils, and oil pastels. But today, we're only going to focus on how to create tints and shades using paint cakes. First, I want to talk a little bit about my setup. You'll notice here that I have my placemat, my paper, my brushes, a mixing plate, my water cup, a paper towel, and of course, my paint cakes. You'll also notice that my black and white paint cakes are separate from the palette. That's to help prevent any accidental color mixing in the palette. Next, I want to talk about the size of brush that you'll want to use. I recommend using a smaller size brush because that helps to limit the amount of water that is in your brush. A larger brush will hold more water, and when you're color mixing with this type of paint, too much water can cause the paint to become runny and watery and very thin. In color mixing with these paints, it's more difficult to mix your colors if your paint is too watery. So in this case, less water is best. You can always add more water if you need to, but if you overdo it, it's difficult to take that extra water away. You could also use a paper towel to help blot off some of the extra water that might be stuck on your brush. I'm going to start now by mixing a tint. The color pink is a great example of a tint. We get pink by mixing red with some white. I like starting with the lighter color first and then adding my darker color into it. White is the lighter one, so I'm going to start with that. I'm building up a good amount of white. Then I'm going to wash off my brush and then just get a teeny tiny amount of the red and swirl it in. By adding just a tiny amount, it gives me a nice light color of pink. If I add more red, it'll give me a version of pink that is just a little bit darker. It can be a lot of fun to play around and explore with how much white and how much color you add and see what you can come up with. Just be sure to always wash and blot your brush off between colors. Now that we've talked about tints, let's talk about shades. To create a shade, you'll mix a small amount of black into any color to create a darker version of that color. I'm going to stick with red again. Just like with the tints, I'm going to start with my lighter color. And looking at the red and the black, I can see that the red is the lighter one. So I'm starting with a clean mixing plate and I'm going to add some red. Then I'll wash off my brush and get just a teeny tiny amount of the black and swirl it into the red. Black is a very powerful color and can quickly take over your other colors if you add too much. So it's best to add tiny amounts little by little until you get the shade that you want. Now I want to show you some helpful tips and tricks for keeping your paint palette clean. Whenever we're color mixing, sometimes our palette can get mixed by accident. We want to try our best to keep the palette clean so that it is ready for other classes to use. Sometimes the palettes get mixed because of the paint water. We clean off our brushes in the paint water and then dip them into the paint palette, and sometimes the paint water can go from the brush right into the palette. If you notice that is happening, it's best to get some fresh water. If you happen to see that paint is already mixed, take care of it by cleaning it off right away. Get a paper towel and bunch it up and dab the mixed paint off. It's best to do this right away before the paint dries. Be helpful and work together to keep our paints clean and unmixed. If you've seen it, you can clean it, even if it's not your mess. Helping to keep our materials in good shape shows integrity by doing the right thing and shows respect for our classroom supplies.